All right. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Luigi Alcañeses. I'll be giving this presentation today for Mobile Matter on the topic of incentive analysis for international relations debates. Um, so it's normal, and I think it's a common experience for everyone to feel intimidated whenever you would encounter a topic that is about IR. It might be because you don't have that much knowledge on the topic, you were not able to matter load, or it could be because it's a widely complicated issue and it would be very difficult to make arguments on many of these issues which are developing as we speak. So usually these topics are very timely, very relevant, and there are a lot of moving parts, which is true for all debates, but particularly might be more complex when we talk about international relations. What I hope to do with this presentation is be able to develop a framework that might make it a little bit easier or doable for people to approach IR debates using what I would call incentive analysis, or at least a foundation of analyzing agent behavior or state behavior against one another based on what their incentives are, how they would likely act based on those incentives, and what the consequences are of the behavior that they would engage in. So yeah, that's what we're gonna focus on today. I'm gonna structure this presentation as follows. Number one, I'm gonna talk about some brief discussion on how to prepare for IR debates. Usually, this is the common focus of many IR presentations. I would just want to briefly touch on some topics and how to consume resources about international relations. Number two, and number three, I'll go into the meat of the lecture, which is going to focus on defining these incentive structures, where I want to focus how you could outline an incentive structure in a debate during prep time and be able to execute it within a speech. And the second part of this main lecture would focus on some guidelines that I developed in analyzing state, region, or global level incentives and dynamics. Since in many international relations debates, we're talking about how to deal with different stakeholders who have different interests, competing interests at sometimes, and different dynamics of power against one another. So it will be very relevant or very helpful for us to also segment our analysis based on the state, regional, and global level and how they would interact with each other on that basis. Usually, many IR topics would cover that, anyways, and usually it would help if you could divide this analysis in that way, so it would be more appropriate to what you are specifically pertaining to, and I'll elaborate on that later on. And then for a lot of this lecture, at least to end this lecture, I'll be focusing on three different examples which I want to work through, and hopefully for those watching this presentation asynchronously, it would also help if you could work on these exercises while we go through this presentation. I'm gonna first go through an example on contextualization, which I entitled "Framing IR Context Using Incentive Analysis." Number two, we're gonna talk about forecasting, dealing with uncertainty using incentive analysis. And then number three, some scenario analysis on weighing competing outcomes using incentive analysis. Again, these are just ways in which I hope to synthesize many of the learnings or some of the guidelines that we're going to be going over today. All right. So firstly, how to prepare for IR debates, and I think it would be helpful to first understand what an IR debate is. International relations, in its most simplest form, is how states interact with one another and how they develop these relationships through history and how they continuously engage with one another as modern states today, which is uh, which manifests in many forms, right? It manifests politically through the diplomatic relationships we engage with one another. It manifests through territory in how we uh, expand our states against one another, or how we deal with the borders between our states. It also involves economic, trade, globalization, or the rejection thereof, globalization, and also it would also involve many of the social aspects of international relations that we're talking about, which would include immigration, it would include culture, and the continuous transfer of individuals from one place to another for different reasons, apart from that, apart from work, for example. So, given that there are many ways in which an IR debate can manifest, so it could manifest in terms of a state sanctioning another state, or a bunch of states forming a regional organization, or two different states handling a territorial dispute with one another. My recommendation always is, rather than looking at every single issue and going through every single topic and looking at the news for a new headline and then memorizing every single news article you will find, or finding an article and then memorizing all of the proper nouns that you will find, I think it's important to practice matter loading in the sense that you are prioritizing the development of mental models of how states interact with one another. What do I mean by this? What I mean is, in debate, you come up with many frameworks that are very useful, because many debates are often going to repeat, or at least repeat in terms of the interactions or the dynamics that we are talking about. So, for example, when you're talking about the mental model of how a state sanctions another state, there are many common themes that would emerge when we talk about how a state sanctions another state. This would involve the threat of those sanctions. How much leverage does this state have over another? It would involve how large this sanction is and how credible the sanction is going to be perceived by this other state actor that is receiving these sanctions. And it will also commonly involve some resolution or some form of expectation as to what the actor must do to or what actors must do to be able to stop the sanctions from worsening in the future. And then you'd also, so that's on the macro level, right? On how the states interact with other states. We also talk about how sanctions affect individuals, or at least in debate language, on how it affect them on the ground. So we're talking about how sanctions, or economic sanctions in particular, may affect the businesses. How might it affect the economic status of the state? A lot of these arguments that people would raise in debates are common themes that would come over and over again. And thus, when we consume resources on how sanctions affect other states, it's not always helpful to just memorize, there's a $2 billion sanction on Swift or something like that. It would help to develop what mental model are we working on, or how is our mental model able to adjust or develop based on the newer developments, or the way in which these actors are behaving against one another. Let me give an example. So, if we were developing the motion or engaging with the motion, this House believes that the international community should offer dictators immunity in exchange for stepping down from their positions of power. You might look to the example of Pol Pot and Cambodia. This is a popular example that was given when this motion was given out very, very long ago. And you would take that example and say, instead of just memorizing all the intricacies of what the international community was offering, what the immunities conditions were, or, for example, how terrible were the atrocities conducted by this dictator, you may learn to develop a mental model of, this dictator is desperate and vulnerable, at the point in which the international community might threaten further sanctions, or from one end, international intervention, or it might also involve an internal civil conflict that might arise from its own power, the power vacuum that might emerge, or is starting to emerge with the weakening influence of the dictator. And thus you might argue that, now I'm learning more about how this power vacuum is emerging. I am learning more about what incentives this dictator has, given the options they currently have. And while I'm reading these news articles on, or reading history as to how this conflict was able to be resolved, or how it developed over time, I'm able to create and, in some sense, generalize how these encounters would usually go about. And thus, you've created a mental model. A mental model is easier for you to refer to because it's easier to memorize. It's also more compact, and it's also very convenient because a mental model can be used for multiple different debates and multiple different scenarios. And thus, you're more equipped to engage a greater number of debates and a greater number of topics instead of just memorizing for the sake of memorizing and then stepping into a debate and not knowing how to apply it. And that's why mental models are important, which is the main focus for this slide, actually. I just want to go over a few things now. Just when you might engage with different types of topics or different types of content while you are matter loading. Some people attempt to create a matter file, right, where they get an article and they summarize it and make it easily digestible for different debaters and a contingent to refer to. If you've noticed, most of the time, people don't really get to refer to an entire matter file whenever they're actually debating in a tournament, which is why I've always recommended to, if you would need facts, then a short fact book would be fine. Maybe you might need an almanac, which might be easily referable. And while you are receiving the pertinent facts that are very helpful to you, such as maybe the name of a dictator that you forgot, then the rest of the mental model is able to fill in the gaps that you could not retrieve until you remember what that fact is. And that's why mental models are very helpful. When you're reading long form readings in nonfiction books, my recommendation is to not take it too seriously, actually. I hope that you could take this opportunity to enjoy and summarize the gist of many of the main themes and arguments that you might engage with. There are some books that I've read over time that have been very helpful to me in terms of uh, international politics and the development of different states across the world in the post colony, or maybe after the Cold War, and how they engage with one another. There might be some specific books that focus on like the South China Sea development and how it changed over time. I read a book called Rock Solid, which is very, very nice in understanding territorial disputes and how they're handled internationally in the arbitration. Um, and in the end, when you're reading throughout an entire book that you are quote unquote specializing in, it's more helpful, in my opinion, to be able to summarize summarize the gist of the arguments, um, understand what is going on and what is driving actors to behave in a particular way, and how the news, how 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 it all boiled down into a few certain relevant factors that contributed to a certain conflict or a certain dilemma that the book might be focusing on. And usually the author might have a clear argument or a clear stance with how everything developed, and that's the benefit of hindsight with many of these readings. Usually they're very helpful because they're well researched most of the time, and there's a lot of sources that they're all pulling from at the same time, instead of focusing on many short form articles which might not always take the biggest part of the picture all the time. So that's the benefit and the advantage of many of these books or readings that you might develop. It you might learn it from a college reading that you might have. You might get a book that you pick up from the store. All of these examples might be very helpful to you, since it helps develop your critical thinking while you are consuming these resources, and that's why it's been very helpful to me as well. If you're engaging with short form articles, my recommendation would be, it would be helpful for you to not read the news all the time. This is important for me because when you are consuming different news resources, like for example, you're waiting for the next headline on the BBC, or if you're following the election and you're like, for example, you're following the US elections and you're looking through the polls every single 10 minutes or 15 minutes, what you would use in, or what you would understand, or what the gist of everything that is going on does not necessarily rely on you checking that resource every single 10 minutes, which is why it might not always be productive for you to look at the news all the time or to look at news headlines all the time. So, my recommendation is asking the question, where does this issue fit in the bigger picture? Where do these newer developments fit in the bigger mental model that I am developing? So when you're consuming resources on the developments of Ukraine right now, it would not be so helpful for you to look at, for example, every single development of where every single military engagement is happening, insofar as you're concerned with what is a broader, more important diplomatic or political or economic solution to the conflict, right? And thus, it's important for you to work from the down up, and knowing that this is one part of a bigger picture at the same time. So it's kind of like the opposite of how you would deal with a reading or a nonfiction book. With books, it would be important for you to get the gist of the main argument and get the theme, and then connect it to real life, modern day developments that you are seeing. And with short form articles or online content, it's very helpful for you to not get every single fact or every single update, but to know where it fits in the bigger picture. So, which is why both of them work at the same time. My other recommendation is, and this is just a caveat I would want to make, many debaters often will attempt to pick and choose what sources and what particular news websites they think are very helpful for them. And that's perfectly fine, especially if you might be very accustomed to reading a certain type of, let's say, a newsletter that you always like referring to. But my recommendation is, at least when there's a trade off, you would want to develop the discipline of reading deeply while developing the practice of reading widely. What I mean by this is, you want to practice being patient with reading an article very critically. And that is why, instead of just reading or speed reading through many matter files, my recommendation is you just want to pick a few articles that are very, very, very meaningful, that contribute to an entire discussion, which is why research is very, very important here. But also developing the practice of reading widely, which is what I mean in terms of the political spectrum, reading a multiple different perspectives as to how an issue is developing and what different perspectives different states are taking on a particular matter. Um, that doesn't mean I'm encouraging people to read on conspiracy theories. Rather encouraging people to develop a more open mindset, but also a more critical mindset, which I believe most of the time makes people have a clear opinion that they would want to stick to afterwards. So I think that's a one way for people to develop the intellectual humility that we're talking about here. Another tip is make use of the academic resources available to you. I learned a lot, for example, in my college years when I would just attend many different um, academic talks or um, engagements that were available to me in school. For example, a particular speaker was invited on a particular expert topic, and I would always enjoy attending many of these different events and conferences, even if I would only learn just like even just a little bit that might be relevant for debate. It was the practice and the habit of wanting to learn more that allowed me to still be interested in these topics and to not just be complacent with maybe some of the common arguments that you might always be accustomed to. So if you want to learn how to develop or improve your sophistication or the way in which you want to communicate your arguments more clearly, it's very helpful to refer to your professors and also the academic resources that you might also see. Which is why I particularly love going to libraries. At the end of this, my goal always is to develop an attitude of humility for lifelong learning and to be patient with yourselves, since you don't become an expert on these topics overnight, and often it the goal of debate, in my opinion, and the goal of reading and being more critical is wanting to be hungry for learning and also wanting to become more and more humble in the process. For those that are interested, usually people always ask this all the time. I would just recommend some of my favorite sources for people to refer to. Just some stories that I have about these. Some of these books were actually recommended in school as well, so it was very helpful for me to read them early on from high school. And then when we went back into college, I read them again, and it was a very, very helpful. Uh, it was very helpful for me, like developing a more critical mindset and rereading many of these topics. So, Why Nations Fail, Prisoners of Geography, In Europe Shadow, and I really do love a lot of Tim Marshall's books or Robert D. Kaplan's books if you're interested in those topics. Some of the news sources I look at are Financial Times, Associated Press. You might also want to refer to Al Jazeera, Fox News. All of these different topics or news sources might be helpful. I don't really always recommend looking at, again, as I said earlier, looking at every single news source and looking at every single development. Usually it's because many of these sources are also taking sources from the same sources too, and they refer to one another. So it's more helpful for me to just, again, read widely, read deeply. Um, some of the YouTube channels I look at, William Spaniel, has a lot of topics related to game theory actually. Cold Fusion, Economics Explained, NTLDR News. Um, the more important question though, that usually is asked is how would you specifically use this information in a debate? And I have one example that I think might be helpful here. I mentioned a while ago, I read a book that was about the international arbitration dispute between the Philippines and China and how it was settled in The Hague eventually. That was a book called Rock Solid. And what I learned in terms of a mental model from that book was that there are many ways in which the pursuit of this arbitration was undermined after the decision was released, which led to why it was likely or why it was um, unsuccessful in a way, in the sense that China would not recognize the arbitration, and the Philippines itself internally was also weak in its bargaining power and leverage to be able to contest the the or enforce, or rather contest, China's refusal to acknowledge this arbitration, simply because China is heavily invested in the Philippines and the Philippines is heavily reliant economically on China. And thus, how you would use that in debates such as this House believes that the arbitration of territorial disputes should be resolved by international bodies as opposed to by the contesting countries. One argument you might raise at opposition is that even if many of these contesting countries are significantly reliant on the larger country that is attempting to cede its territory against it, you would argue that this is a far preferable compromise that actors can agree on, rather than allowing, for example, in the case of The Hague and the case of the ICC being involved in the arbitration dispute between the Philippines and China, making it or delaying any economic progress between two countries because another third party actor is attempting to slow down any diplomatic engagements at all between these countries. So you might argue that this delay, that this lag time that occurs between these two countries, uh, causes worse economic cooperation, it worsens political alliances, and it also finds it hard for any other state to respect this arbitration ruling, which is why it's likely to be unsuccessful. So, if you notice, what I am explaining here is you're not just going to highlight, oh, The Hague was unsuccessful, China never recognized it, that's why it doesn't work. You want to use the information as a way to leverage the argument and as a way for the argument to also be clear as to where it is being applied in the example, and when you are going back to what the general state of affairs is in the argument. So again, to summarize, it's very, very important to use the mental model in the argument, but also be very precise as to when the example applies, when it doesn't apply, and also uh, what motivated this example of matter that you're using to be applicable in the argument, right? This is very, very important in my opinion, because people make the mistake often to um perhaps in some sense just matter vomit and just say all the information that they think is relevant, but usually the strategy may not always be successful because judges might not always be able to consume all of the information that you're saying at one single moment. So it's important to intertwine the argument and the example together in a very, at least in a beautiful way that I think would be easily digestible and communicable. All right. So now let's move on to the main content of this lecture that I hope to focus on. I'll be talking about defining an incentive structure and outlining an incentive structure. And then afterwards, I'm going to talk about some guidelines that I think would be helpful in developing the state, regional, and global aspects of incentives and dynamics. So, firstly, talking about defining or outlining what an incentive structure is and um, being able to apply it in a debate setting. For the purpose of this presentation, I would want to define an incentive structure as the following. You could ask the questions of what are the set of reasons for why agents do what they do given the information that is presented to them. Additionally, what is their ranking of their own preferences? And you notice this is very similar to how you would talk about how individuals would engage in their day-to-day behavior or the reasons for why they do what they do. For example, if you were a person that is going to a grocery shop, you have a reason for why you are going to the grocery. You have a particular knowledge of what is contained in the grocery or what is likely contained in the grocery for what you are going to purchase. And then you would have a list that, in some sense, prioritizes or ranks what you are going to purchase first and what you are going to focus on given your limited resources, which is your money. The same would apply definitely for many of these international states that are engaged with one another. So many states engage in diplomatic, political, economic, social relationships with other countries, and they do so based on public sentiment, public will, the information that is presented to them through the media. And many institutions that are leading the decision-making process in the state have different reasons as to why they are engaging in their behavior. So they might, for example, engage in a sanction against another country as a retaliatory mechanism. And the reason that they might do so is because they believe that a certain country is interfering with their political system, and thus this retaliation is an effort to be able to express their nationalism and a defense of their sovereignty against another country. Internally, what this would look like is that politicians are attempting to appeal to the public sentiment, which might be xenophobic in some instances, to be able to reject a certain investment or a certain set of immigration policies provided by another country. And thus, there is an effort to distance yourself from this country, given the information they're provided. Again, we break this down every part. Individuals have their own preferences and their reasons as to why they are engaging in voting for a certain policy, be it Brexit or be it an immigration policy. And politicians have their own reasons to also engage in this system, be it to satisfy what the public will is, or to also ensure that this other country they're engaging with is not going to uh, retaliate against itself in the future, which might lead to worse economic consequences, which is also bad for the politicians that are involved in this instance, right? And all of this involves what their ranking of preferences is, right? It involves what they believed is important, what their priorities are, and what they are willing to sacrifice in order to be able to pursue a certain end goal. Let's take for the example the motion. This house believes that it is in the interest of China to de-escalate its trade war with the Biden administration. You might, as China, again, I want to be very clear here. If we are operating in the interest of China, we are talking about at least or most likely not only the interest of those who are part of the administration of China or the political administration of China, but we are talking about, at least in some sense, what is most likely the interest of the Chinese people and most Chinese citizens who are a significant stakeholder as part of the broader interest of China. And given that we are talking about these interests and what their sets of preferences likely are, which might include but not be limited to the economic development of their own state, the ability for these citizens to attain jobs and have job stability, or also to be able to make sure that their own businesses are preserved versus other foreign companies which might interfere in their economic success. You might argue that in this context, an increasing trade war is detrimental to these specific interests of economic development, job security, and also the ability for them to continue preserving their economic businesses. On one end, right? On one end, but on another end, you might argue, which the other team might argue, that it's also an interest of China to be able to continuously exert its influence by expanding the Belt and Road Initiative, engaging with many debt-ridden countries, and making sure that they're also economically reliant on them. And this can only be propagated through the existence of this trade war or the pursuit of it, of increasing sanctions against other countries, or like the U.S., for example. In any case, or in either case, we're not even talking about what happens with de-escalation or escalation of the trade war. It is important to establish what is the interest of China and what are the priorities of Chinese citizens given this. And how can we deconstruct each and every one of these preferences that we're talking about when we're talking of China? So that involves, again, broadly, the macro interests of being able to expand or defeat influence of other competing global hegemonic powers, or being able to satisfy many of the alliances and relationships it currently has by having capital and money to do so, or being able to satisfy many of the economic domestic interests of citizens, which involve job security and all of the things that we talked about a while ago. All of these are parts, or partial to the set of reasons and preferences of China. And thus, usually my recommendation always is to spend a significant amount of time developing what these reasons are, so that the argument that you will later on launch is a cleaner battleground for you to be able to debate on. Number two, what is the process in which these incentives manifest for different types of actors? And let's take another example. If the motion where this house believes that it is in the interest of Hungary or Viktor Orban, it's a misspelling there, to veto further EU sanctions on Russia, I think it would be important for you to also emphasize that Hungary is different from the interests of Viktor Orban, right? Um, because in the same way, this house as X motion is different from a this house believes that motion, you would say that the interests of state actors and state representatives is very different from the interest of the entire state or country. They can overlap, yes, and they can also distance themselves from each other's interests. Like, for example, you could argue that a more progressive or youthful population of Hungary is against many of the pro-Russian sentiments of the generation of Viktor Orban and those who were from the conservative sect of his government. And thus, it is not completely in the interest of Hungary as a whole to be able to always be on the side of Russia, especially when it comes to an engagement like this, right? So, in this sense, you might argue that these incentives for different actors manifest in different ways. Like, an authoritarian leader has an incentive for stability, yes, and they might be connected in terms of economic progress, yes, that is also an interest. And that economic progress might coincide with continued economic engagement with Russia, yes. But, right, the way these interests manifest, these incentives, common incentives manifest, is different from the incentives of individual citizens and where they coincide on the issue of economic progress and economic development. Because the interest of Viktor Orban is rooted in his ability to continue his authoritarian regime because it is directly endorsed by Russia. But the interest of many citizens in their pursuit of economic stability and progress is rooted in their lived experience of avoiding worsening inflation, protecting their family, maybe staying loyal to some notion of nationalism or whatever, right? These are all different ways in which these incentives manifest. And sometimes they can align, but the reasons as to why they align is very different. So why do I think this is important? Why do I think this is important? I think this is important because it allows you to be clear on the extents to which these incentives stick, right? Because if you're able to sufficiently argue, for example, in this example that I've just developed for you now, if you're able to sufficiently argue that this alliance with Russia is not likely always going to lead to continued sustaining power of the authoritarian regime of Viktor Orban, then you would argue that on one end, it is within Viktor Orban's incentive to be able to also cooperate with the EU on sanctions on Russia. And thereby, it is much more appealing and more likely that the public is also going to be supportive of this policy as well. Right? As one way you can formulate these incentives to demonstrate a more likely outcome, which is that Hungary is going to cede on this issue of being completely loyal to Russia all the time. Again, that's just one way you can formulate it. Again, that would also depend on how you weigh it against other incentives that Viktor Orban may have, or how it might, or how people expect EU sanctions might affect Russia, or it also might depend on how they think Hungary would be affected if this veto were to be pursued. Again, these are different access points of information that would affect the way in which they value a certain position that they would take. I hope that's clear, right? Because if, for example, you are then arguing that people believe that Russia would sanction them more if they did not veto EU sanctions, right? If they believe that Russia's influence is so large on that extent, then you could argue the counterfactual that it is now likely that the public sentiment does align with Viktor Orban's incentive to continue his authoritarian regime by being able to preserve economic stability and progress as cooperated with Russia as well. That is completely possible because it depends on the information that they're given. Just one last point then, given these two things that I think are very, very important in outlining or defining an incentive structure. Outlining incentives then allows you to provide a clear foundation from which actions can be weighed in terms of likelihood. So now that you've clearly defined or outlined what these reasons are, what information sets they have, and how this information affects their likely behavior or perception of affairs, then you would also, or and also you've also defined what the ranking of these preferences are, then it's easier for you now to argue which actions are more likely or which reactions are more likely in a debate. So let's say, for example, the motion was this House believes that ASEAN should make Myanmar's membership contingent on active restoration efforts for its democratic institution and systems. Even before, even before you were arguing about what the democratic institution or restoration efforts are likely going to look like, even before you reach that point, if you've already made it clear that it is within Myanmar's incentive, or at least specifically, if we're talking about Myanmar, we're talking about the current military junta that is in power. Also, we're talking about other competing groups that are might be willing to engage in violence but are willing to compromise on the pursuit of free and fair elections. But we're also talking about individual citizens that might have been sympathetic to the regime but are not so sympathetic now as the economy continues to collapse. You might argue that on the basis of these incentives, right? Now it is more likely that all warring parties in Myanmar might be willing to compromise with ASEAN by creating a coalition government, so long as everyone gets to retain their jobs and so long as everyone gets to continue to operate in their business in Myanmar. So that's completely possible. But it depends on how you are formulating that incentive structure. Because the other team can completely say that it is also within the incentive of Myanmar to deny or not believe that these restoration efforts are going to be successful, and thus it would just lead to even significant disunity and being cut out of ASEAN economic benefits, which would make it even more easy or easier for the military junta to be able to cement themselves in power for a longer time. Because people within Myanmar, especially warring factions or other rebels, do not simply believe that these restoration efforts will be successful and thus will never cooperate with any engagement initiated by this government, which would make it worse for everyone overall. So, if you noticed, all I'm doing here is just demonstrating that either Myanmar's incentives for different stakeholders align or they do not align. And if they do align, they would compromise. If they do not align, then their belief on the success of this restoration efforts is going to cause its failure. And thus, because they don't align in their incentives, this pursuit is not going to be compromised, or they're not gonna reach a compromise. And that's one way you can approach it. Again, we haven't even talked about what the restoration efforts would look like, or whether or not the government is actually going to be benevolent. We're only operating on information of the belief of individuals of it and how that would affect their incentives and their reactions and behavior against one another. Well, before we move on to this part of the presentation, this is the meat of the presentation now, I'm now just gonna drink some water. All right. So there are three guidelines that I think are important to go over when we are talking about analyzing state, regional, and global level incentives and dynamics. The first thing I'll go over is referring to the respective histories of states, which I would define as, at least summarize as, past behavior. Number two, I would talk about how it's important to highlight the power dynamics that are at play, which I would call bargaining credibility. And number three, I would talk about segmenting your analysis based on the state, regional, and global scale impacts that are relevant in the debate, which I would just call micro macro. So if you want to just remember what these all are, number one, past behavior. Number two, bargaining credibility. And number three, micro macro. Right? So number one, um, talking about past behavior. A few questions that I think are important to ask. So I'm gonna go with this a little bit faster now, for the sake of presentation. But if you would want to ask a little bit more about it, I would encourage you to be able to practice these motions on your own and also answer these questions using the motions and examples that I'll be providing. So, number one, what are the pre-existing relationships between stakeholders? This is an important question to ask because you want to establish what are their alliances like, what are the reasons as to why they are aligned with a certain country, why they are not aligned with a certain country, and what are the likely tipping points as to when an alliance or relationship is unlikely going to continue or why it is likely going to persevere. So, for example, if the motion was this House of South Korea would aim to significantly increase its cross border economic cooperation with North Korea, I just want to explain, right? There was an argument very, very long ago that would be raised wherein one of the arguments in favor of reunification or being able to ease efforts towards reunification, which would then involve like cross-border economic cooperation, is that the generation, right? The generations of families that were separated at the point of the Korean War has caused a significant trauma to the nation, that they feel that their family is being trapped there, that they feel that they have been separated for so long. And this is a very persuasive argument very, very long ago. Because again, it's about a pre-existing relationship of families that are connected with one another, that what binds them together through culture is a social relationship that is very fundamental to the identity of what it means to be a Korean. That it is not limited to borders and nationalism or what your propaganda says you should do. By blood, by family, you are destined to reunite with one another. And this is a very strong narrative. It was a strong narrative, or it has been a strong narrative. What I'm talking about now is not, as time has gone by, as many of these generations or families have built out or have died out, this argument is not as persuasive as it was before. Instead, what you're talking about now is not about the familial relationships or reasons as to why these people are connected with another through blood or through family or through social relationships. You're talking about, is there a possibility for our histories to coincide, or at least be able to mutually assure that there is a better future that we can develop as one entire state, which is, again, it's kind of like pertaining to some pre-civilization or some pre-war dynamics of what it means to be a state, and questioning what it means to be uh engaged in diplomacy or in good terms with other nations. For example, until now, North Korea still has not declared the end of the Korean War, whereas the interpretation of history in South Korea is that this was already resolved very long ago. And these relationships and these narratives are also defined by how their other alliances have also determined themselves over time, such as the influence of the US or the influence of China in the Korean War, and why this is very, very a strong narrative that, in some sense, victimized many of these families that were also separated, which is also one way in which this conflict persists until today. So a question of the debate also is, have we come to a point where we can separate this history of associating our enemies with our other enemies, and could we now be able to pursue a diplomatic or peaceful process on that basis? I don't know, but it's important to take these pre-existing relationships into account, because the terms in which these divisions were created also determine where they are likely going to be headed. Number two, how has history determined the ideological positions of these states? A very simple example is the motion this House supports the return of U.S. military bases to the Philippines. I'm sure you're aware of a very long colonial history in the Philippines. But I think what's important to highlight in a motion like this is that it did create internal divisions of class and inequality, which also determined the experience of people under these respective colonial regimes. So when the United States was able to have significant control over the government of the Philippines, and thus determining how it would create its own government and the democratization process that also ensued afterwards, it was also shaping the ideological stances of many people at the time, in favor of the US for some, but also completely unsympathetic to the US for others, wherein people believed that they were still being colonized and were still being controlled, and the entire trauma of um, being abused under these states continues until today. So the question is, given that a complex relationship of the um, anti-imperial sentiments persist until today with respect to military bases, whereas this is positioned in opposition to an existing sympathetic narrative in favor of US military presence because of the weak position of the Philippines, where do they align? And you might argue that these incentives align in some notion of nationalism, in some notion of independence, and thus part of being able to argue whether or not the public is going to be in favor of this policy is also determined on how likely is future generations going to be willing to accept this, how likely is history textbooks going to accept this, how likely is our education system conducive to be able to accept this, right? This is all part of shaping national consciousness and ideological position, which also determines how likely they are going to receive a certain action in this context. Number three, how much resistance is there against repeating history with respect to foreign relationships? And what I want to highlight here is, when we talk about resistance, we don't mean to say that the resistance is always good, right? Because there could also be, for example, within a country like Japan, an entirely um extreme far right wing extremist stance in favor of a return to the glory of um, Japan and its empire, which might involve the celebration of, for example, many war criminals that were involved in World War II. But it's not to say that resistance is always bad as well, right? Because resistance can also, in some sense, be a positive force in counterbalancing against other dominant notions of history that were, at least in some sense, manufactured by the elite or manufactured by those that were in power. And thus, you might argue that um, the past behavior of these countries also allows them to call back to a narrative that states that we could aspire for something else. Like in the case of this motion, this tells me that Japan should acquire nuclear weapons. Of course, as you might be aware, this motion is pertaining to the pacifist constitution in Japan and whether or not it should, in some sense, create some form of military um, leverage against another country that could engage in active aggression with the possibility of using nuclear weapons. You might argue that this resistance against an unwilling or an uncooperative or an inconsistent isolationist United States does demonstrate that Japan's yearning for independence is not merely an exertion of just wanting to go back to its roots of being able to be aggressive against other powers, but it's also them reformulating their own national identity today as one that is not purely dependent on the cooperation or the approval or permission of another foreign country that also coincidentally also caused a lot of national trauma in its state. Again, history is complicated, guys. It's very, very complicated. But what's important is you want to break down these incentives and you want to break down what this resistance looks like, what factions are we talking about, and where this yearning to do something is coming from, and what reasons do they have to engage in this behavior for this to be successful or unsuccessful. Which is why looking at past behavior and looking at history is very, very helpful here so that we are clear as to how we contextualize why they are in the position they are in today. All right, that's basically it. Number two, bargaining credibility. What specific form of power is being leveraged? So now we're talking about the influence that countries exert on one another. We're talking about power dynamics. So usually people might think that this is only about large countries against small countries. Usually all the time you'd think about, oh, it's just another debate about the US and China and how it engages in other weak states across the world. But I would want you to also think about the different ways of power that it is exerted. So I don't only mean soft power, like in the case of a very strong media sentiment in favor of K-pop or whatever, which could, obviously it could contribute to some international diplomatic relations that does allow them to more easily send businesses and immigrants to the other countries and one another in cooperation with each other. Yes, it's all good, but we're also talking about different forms of power other than military power. We're talking about the power to, say, for example, economically be able to control the resources of another country, technologically be able to threaten another country with their information systems, like data and data vulnerability, for example. Or we're also talking about the power that involves being able to uh, be an entry point for many other alliances that other states might be willing to invest in. Like again, we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and being able to be party to other larger alliances that other states are also involved in. Because those alliances would not otherwise exist if not for particular countries that are involved, right? The example here is this House supports the US's foreign policy becoming increasingly isolationist. Here, I think it's important to emphasize that the that the US foreign policy is not only reliant on just it's not only reliant on being able to send soldiers and then pull them out and then be unreliable because of that, like having naval ships that could shoot at another place all the time. But the power we are talking about is the power of continental lift. It's the power of military bases and territories and embassies that are well protected across the world that also serves as in some sense, you could argue, as a guarantee for mediating negotiations aligned with what the US would specifically want. Right? That's one way you could argue that this was an essential foreign policy component that the US had, but now no longer has as much before relative to before. But you might also argue that this open vacuum changes the way in which countries engage with one another. Like, for example, given that the military bases are not as prominent as before, and given that the US is less willing to engage in economic engagement with other countries or resolving territorial disputes with other countries, you might also argue that other actors would enter into the sphere and exert other forms of power, which is why the exertion that China has over other countries is more related to debt and loans, and the economic vulnerability of these countries rather than a military exertion of influence. Because uh because China has not invested significant resources in building militaries across the world, right? Number two, how credible are these threats? Um, Again, this is an important question because it's related to information. How threatening is this country to another country? And how legitimate do people believe that this threat actually is? So, for example, if the motion where this House believes that the assassination of political leaders should be a legitimate tactic in war, right? It is perfectly a valid argument to say that many political leaders don't actually believe that they will be assassinated, right? It's perfectly legitimate to say that a lot of them feel that they have closed off their insider group and they've preserved secrets for a very, very long time. And thus, there are no reasons for other people to engage in a successful assassination against them. On the other hand, you can argue that people would believe that it's very credible as a threat for certain countries, right? That they believe that at every point in time, one advisor might suddenly turn and take advantage of them, that one of their close security guards might suddenly turn against them as well, or while they're in the safety of their own home, someone's gonna bomb them or whatever, which would also change the behavior of many of these political leaders. They might engage in preemptive warfare. They might engage in less, or even you might even argue more negotiations against other countries, right? Um, or even they might be willing to engage in more covert assassinations against other political leaders which they don't agree with as well. Perfectly possible consequences. Um, and thus, what I just want to highlight here is that this mental model applies for any other threat that other states have against one another. How legitimate is the threat, of example, of China pulling out of the Philippines, or China pulling out of a certain country that it's invested in, even if even if this country has not paid for its loans, right? You could still argue that there are still many reasons for China to still be significantly invested in a country that hasn't paid its loans against it in one end. Or you might also argue that there are many counter incentives for China to move to another country because it might be worth it to invest there rather than this other country. Again, these are not always mutually exclusive, But it's very, very important for you to demonstrate how likely or how credible these threats actually are, and whether states are likely going to follow through on them. Number three, how does the expected behavior of relatively powerful states affect the choices of others? Which is why I think um, it's important to still highlight, even if states are posturing against one another, like posturing for the sake of publicity or reputation, or being able to threaten another country for the sake of threatening them, even if they're not likely going to follow through in it, it causes significant instability already. And it also changes the choices of other states too. Like, for example, even just the announcement that the US would be initiating a pullout against Afghanistan already prompted the Taliban to already take over, even before the pullout was already underway or even fully underway, right? So, it's important for you to also analyze how, again, without going too far deep into it, how do states expect other states to behave? For example, their alliances or other close states, neighboring states, and how are they likely going to engage as a consequence of that? Another example is could be like the free rider problem with immigration and refugees in Europe. If certain states believe that other states were already willing to accept a mass majority of refugees, then other states might not be willing to accept refugees as well. Or you might argue that in this one, the example here, this sounds like the UN should abolish the UNSC veto. You might argue that um, certain states still have an incentive to vote according to what they want to vote, even if this will be vetoed anyways, because they want to preserve an alliance or relationship with other parties that are significant to them. Which is why, you might still see that states would vote in favor of a resolution to sanction Russia, even though Russia would veto every single resolution that the UN would have. It might not manifest in anything material in terms of the actual resolution of the UN, but it manifests in a very stronger, for example, in what we're seeing now, a stronger NATO coalition, because these countries are committed to cooperating with one another against another stronger regime or another relatively more aggressive regime, right? Number three, this is the last guideline now to talk about the micro and macro. How do their respective domestic situations influence their international stances? Here, what I want to talk about is how do we move from like the smaller state level to the medium state level, to regional levels, to also global aspects of how people or states develop their international stances. So we just do it one by one. Number one, for the states itself, how do their respective domestic situations influence their international stances? And here, example I'd give is just this interest of the UK to abandon the Northern Ireland Brexit protocol, which is just the hard or soft border that's existed in Northern Ireland for Ireland, the rest of Ireland, to continue trading with the rest of the European Union, which is essential for it to continue its businesses and continue its economic relationships without an additional sanction that would have been caused by Brexit. It's important to talk about how it affects, for example, how businesses and citizens who have voted in favor of Brexit, how their change of economic circumstance is also affecting their public sentiment, the mainstream media, and also affecting how they vote in many of these elections and what their priorities are. So you might be aware that many individuals voted in favor of Brexit because of a significant amount of misinformation that they might have been exposed to, or certain beliefs of an economic revival of the UK outside of the EU that they thought would have been very good for them. In this context, for the Northern Ireland Brexit Protocol, you might think that some people were very in favor of were very much in favor of the Brexit protocol, but might have changed their mind, right? And thus might be willing to compromise more and de-escalate the acceleration of Brexit continuously happening, which might happen, um, or might not happen in this instance. Number two, how are choice sets predetermined by regional geography? Again, I just referred you to the book on prisoners of geography, but an example I just want to mention here is that this house believes that the West should introduce a complete ban on the purchase of Russian oil and natural gas. The reason as to why might say this motion might be very difficult in some sense is that many Eastern European states simply are constrained by a lot of the pipelines that have already been created for a very, very long time alongside Russia, which is why it's very difficult for them to transition to Western sources of oil or natural gas, and why many of them are politically and economically reliant on Russia as well. So a lot of this is predetermined by geography, and a lot of this makes it easier for you to identify what their incentives are. But also, you can explain why these incentives have been failing, right? Like why we have seen since Russia's economy has continuously been failing and not been delivering on its promises as a consequence of spending too much on the military. You might argue that now, oh hey, this is a perfect opportunity for the West to be able to step in and engage more deeply economically with many of these states, so long as they're not so dependent anymore. So it's, again, you might argue on one hand it's a perfect opportunity, but on the other hand, it might be a lost cause. But in either case, you're saying that the choice sets are determined by regional geography, and thus many of the economic relationships they also make are also in unison created simultaneously based on these incentive structures as well, right? That's also one thing you might talk about, the TPP or CPTPP, for example, which was made initially as one way to get them together with the West. But when the US pulled out from the TPP long ago, they created the CPTPP. And then when many states across Southeast Asia and even with other states that are sympathetic to many countries that are vulnerable to territorial disputes with China, it was one way in which they were able to strengthen their economic relationship with one another vis-a-vis like ASEAN and other regional agreements that were already coexisting with them. So that was a very good thing. That's one way you could argue that it's very convenient and it's very, very helpful and easier for them to distance themselves from other hegemonic powers that might have other pernicious incentives in engaging in this relationship, like the US, for example, in favor of making other regional relationships that might be helpful for them. Another question is, what do neighboring states have in common with one another? And yeah, just the example I gave you, you might argue that many Southeast Asian nations have a common experience of colonialism, have a common experience of territorial disputes against particular countries, or might have even common internal conflicts that are very, very difficult for them to um, forgo or forget about. Like, for example, like repression against a particular religious ethnicity, for example, or religious sect, right? Um, you might argue that these differences might make it harder for you to engage in these relationships, or certain similarities might make it easier as well. Um, Again, all possible when you talk about motions like this. Like for the motion of this house believes that Southeast Asian nations should actively move towards a consolidation of a regional alliance at the expense of seeking stronger ties with non-regional allies. You might argue that this initiative might fail merely because um, many of the weak democratic systems in Southeast Asian nations and the hijacking that has been caused by many political dynasties among these nations, or the rise of authoritarian leaders in these places, has made it harder and harder for these Southeast Asian nations to trust one another which is also caused by, again, these differences that they have with each other, uh, exacerbating again the divide and the conflict that might arise as a consequence. All right, so we're gonna move on to the last part of this lecture and this presentation. I'm gonna briefly just go over three examples, worked examples that I think might be helpful. Again, I'm gonna go over the question, the motion, and my brief answer for this question and exercise. My recommendation is you probably spend some more time on doing it on your own, since it might be helpful for you. But I just want you to try it out and think about it yourself. So let's say the first example. The first example and the exercise is on contextualization. So the exercise is you want to develop a clear context based on incentive structures or based on incentive analysis. Let's say the motion was this house prefers a world where post colonial states refuse to cooperate with their colonial masters in the process of democratization. And your exercise is very simple. In order to develop the problem, right? You're developing a problem or a context that you want to focus on. What is the most strategic frame to contextualize this debate, given the competing incentives of post colonial states and the colonial masters? Right? So, you already know that the debate will have a very convoluted discussion of what post-colonial states are and what their incentives are, and what colonial masters and their incentives are, right? Like even after, right? Even after the process of democratization being initiated in these states. So, what strategic frame or context would you want to approach with? You might answer with the following. You might say post-colonial states. It's important to highlight that there are significant divisions or inequalities between sympathizers and victims of colonial regimes. Like for example, the elite class that was propagated by many of these puppet governments in these colonial regimes. And thus, even these differences persisted until the post-colony, right? But you might also argue at the same time that even these individuals, sympathizers and victims, both have a common incentive for stability because they don't want the risk of military or civil conflict or the risk of the government breaking down apart. Which is why, for some people, democratization might still be an incentive for them, or even if they don't pursue democratization with a colonial master, they might still be willing to cooperate for some coalition government that would be created, even if it isn't a democracy, right? On the other hand, you might argue colonial masters have an incentive to compete against other states vying for influence in this territory, which is why, on one hand, you might argue they're benevolent in some sense to be able to make sure this democratization process is going to be successful and going to be equitable and going to be free and fair. But on the other hand, you might argue they have a strong leverage to extend their stay through electoral manipulation, which might undermine the credibility of these elections, or even the presence of these colonial masters might also change the incentives of the public because they might believe that any result is endorsed by this or government and is not necessarily reflective of the will of the people. That might change the choice set of individuals. But it's important to frame out, or at least frame many of these incentives as strong, dominating incentives for what people are likely going to think or do. That's the first example. So I hope the exercise was fair in at least highlighting some of the topics I was talking about earlier. We highlighted in this one, we talked about how different stakeholders manifest their incentives. We talked about different stakeholders internally to the state and how they engage each other as a state or also against another state. And we also talked about how, in this case, these incentives can work or not work against you for a particular argument as well. Again, rooted in history and rooted in all of the different conflicts that have also persisted over time. Number two, let's say the motion was this House believes that the UN should cease facilitating the writing of a new Syrian constitution until the Syrian-led, Syrian-owned Constitutional Committee agrees to include representatives from the Syrian Kurds. And your exercise is given opposition is likely to respond with a breakdown of the entire process of writing a new Syrian constitution, how would you preempt this claim from government to ensure that this is a better compromise for most stakeholders? And yeah, to be fair, this exercise is just about forecasting. How would you uh, demonstrate that an outcome is going to be more likely than another outcome? And what you can do is just forecast using incentive analysis. So it is within their incentive to do a certain thing, and thus that is why it is more likely that they're going to do a certain thing. That's basically what this exercise is. You don't need to overcomplicate it. And for this one, in this motion, opposition, opposition would run an argument that this Syrian constitution with the Syrian Kurds is gonna break down, and they might argue this because there's an incentive for the Syrian majority or other people, part of the government, to want to kick them out of this discussion so that they can take control of the territory of Kurdistan, for example, right? Or what would be Kurdistan in this sense. So you want to preempt that argument and say that this is going to be successful compromise that is mutually beneficial for everyone. And you might answer by saying, our strategy would be, I would demonstrate that one of the main reasons for the delay and failure of the constitutional reform process is that the uncertainty of the Kurds' response prompts parties to not fully commit to its writing. Right? This is a very excellent preemption that I think might be helpful here, because now you're saying that because of incentives for self-preservation and avoiding, or at least continuing, a war of attrition, right? You would believe that it is now in the incentive of Syria and its multiple factions, of Turkey, who are engaged with the Kurds, or even Syrian Kurds, to participate in this deal, to mutually agree on further ceasefires, precisely because they want to avoid a war of attrition that might happen if many of these stakeholders do not know what the Syrian Kurds are going to do. For example, what we're saying here is, why is the constitutional reform process being delayed? Because people are afraid that the Syrian Kurds might secede and engage in military conflict with a very strong military and influence that they have. Or they're afraid that Turkey might be prompted to also invade and also preemptively try and kick out the Syrian Kurds, which might also be harmful to many of Syria and its multiple factions and many villages that are also located in what would be Kurdistan. So in this sense, you might argue Kurds and the people of the Kurds, they have some leverage in terms of territory and also some leverage in terms of military ability, even if they're not the largest military faction. But the fact that they have so much leverage because of the uncertainty that is caused, it makes it harder for anyone to form a fully formed government. And thus, because people want a fully formed government and want economic stability and economic prosperity in the post-war scenario, they're more willing to cooperate in the formation of this constitution as long as they compromise with the Kurds. And they'll be perfectly fine with that. That's one way you can argue that it would lead to further ceasefires instead of further lags and further difficulties in operating in this. Obviously, you have to be wary of opposition's argument that would say that because the UN is facilitating this initiative, it would be seen as propagating anti-Western sentiments, it would be seen as propagating Western incentives. It would be hijacked by the US, who is very affiliated with the Kurds, and all of these different scenarios, right? So this is all part of demonstrating whether people are credibly believing this initiative is going to be successful or whether it would not be successful. Right, last example now. The last one is basically on scenario analysis, and we're just going to be weighing competing outcomes against one another. And let's say the motion was, this House believes that the Biden administration should pursue a more aggressive and antagonistic position with Iran in renegotiating the JCPOA, which is the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Again, the Iran nuclear deal, if that's familiar with everyone. And the exercise basically is, given that it is expected that teams will disagree on whether Iran will retaliate or cooperate, this is a very common theme in many debates. People will just argue, oh, Iran's never gonna cooperate, Iran's gonna retaliate. How would you weigh the likelihood of these competing outcomes? And this is very, very important because what we're tapping on here as a skill is not only identifying the incentives, right? But also identifying what the inherent priorities of Iran are and how their beliefs on what would likely happen to them are also going to affect their stances on this issue. So here's how I would answer. I would, for example, examine for the purposes of context that Iran's choice sets or choices are already currently limited. So there's weakening influence across the Middle East, like many of the military factions that it currently supports, like Hezbollah, for example, or Hamas. You might argue that the weakening influence across the Middle East makes it harder for them to compete against Saudi Arabia, and thus they're already a threat economically and politically, and many of the threats that they currently have are not as credible. You might argue that there's uncertain support from Russia and China, like the weakening economy of Russia, the vulnerable economy of China, etc., etc. So, given that Iran's choices are currently limited, you might argue that there are incentives to prevent a domestic crisis. But more importantly, you would argue that these domestic incentives override other incentives for revenge or to strike back. That you can agree that they have an incentive that is anti Western because of their social conditioning, because of the propaganda that the government has been giving them for a very, very long time. And it's perfectly valid to say that many of them feel that the Iran nuclear deal and the sanctions that have been imposed have been very harmful to many of them. That would have prompted, for example, um, uh, inflation or another internal economic crisis. You would argue that it is this exact reason, right? This exact reason to say that given their choices are limited, instead of opting for desperation and military conflict or the potential for further war, or even trying to look for other actors and relying on Russia and China, because those options are not available, they would rather earn the side of caution and cooperate with a more antagonistic and threatening US that is reviving the JCPOA in order to avoid worsening economic crisis as well. And you'd say this is more important than any other incentive it currently has, even if it might be, even if they might have this incentive that might be very negative. You might even argue that this negative incentive, right? The revenge or strike back narrative is rooted in another manifestation that they're able to redirect this blame to the government because it's the government that is unwilling to compromise with the US instead of directing it solely towards the US. But in either scenario, you're still arguing that the domestic crisis overrides it for the lives of individuals, for the lives of the politicians and the leaders of Iran. And that is why they're more likely going to cooperate with this. Obviously, on the other side, you might argue that this exact context, like the choice set being limited, are also reasons as to why they might be more and more desperate and why they might have more difficulty cooperating and why this only does more harm than good. Those are all perfectly possible, but that would lean on another entire discussion on the effects of sanctions and people's beliefs on the effect of sanctions, which again complicates the debate a little bit more. And that's where it becomes a little bit more fun, right? Because you can always just weigh different scenarios according to your preference. All right, so now let me just move on to some concluding thoughts that I think might be helpful at the end of this presentation. So I think international relations debates are actually very doable and are often exaggerated to be very complicated, to be very difficult to engage in because you don't know anything. But what I hope that people would learn today is that if you adopt a more intellectually humble mindset and if you engage in a lifelong learning journey of wanting to read more and be more critical and be more open to other ideas, then and other perspectives, then it is easier to create a mental model of how agents or international state actors engage with one another. As I mentioned in this discussion, we focused on many different topics, like, for example, the histories of different states, the ways in which they determine their beliefs internally, regionally, and globally, and also how information determines their beliefs and their expectations of how actions are going to be conducted. And we also talked about how these uh, these incentives translate into action, and how we can weigh it based on likelihood, how we can weigh it based even in uncertainty, or how we can weigh it in favor of a certain context that we want to promote. And all of this doesn't require all the knowledge in the world. It requires the model. It requires a mental model that is more easily accessible, and hopefully makes it more fun to debate with. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you everyone for the wonderful time that you've all spent listening to this lecture. And I apologize for going a bit over time. But yeah, hope you learned a little bit, and enjoy and take care, and have a wonderful time. And I hope you have a great time in your debate journey. Thank you everyone. Have a wonderful day.